my contribution to this conference, which I very much welcome, is entitled Reviving the JCPOA, What is at Stake for International Peace and Security? So it concentrates on the geopolitics and the diplomacy and not on the technology, about which I am no expert. So the survival of the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA, has hung by a thread ever since the Trump administration in 2017 unilaterally walked out of its commitment under the deal and opted instead for a policy of, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, on Iran. Meanwhile, that thread, that slender thread, has grown even thinner and more tenuous as a result of Iran rolling back many of the constraints on its nuclear program contained in the deal. And as the E3, that's France, Germany, and the UK, their efforts to provide the sanctions relief set out in the deal have proved ineffective in the face of the cat's cradle of US secondary sanctions. Now, one thing that can be said with a degree of certainty is that the Trump policy of, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, has neither worked in terms of its proclaimed objective of bringing Iran back to the negotiating table to accept tougher terms than those in the JCPOA, nor has it worked in terms of its unproclaimed but barely concealed objective of bringing about a regime change in Iran. Since January of this year, 2021, however, that thread has strengthened somewhat as the Biden administration has set about rejoining the JCPOA without posing any additional conditions other than that Iran roll back its departures from the original deal. And Iran has, in principle, expressed a willingness to contemplate that. But delicate issues of choreography and sequencing remain to be resolved and are under negotiation in Vienna. Indirect negotiation, since the US and Iran are not meeting. It would be, I would suggest, singularly unwise to exaggerate the strengthening of the thread which has so far taken place, or to assume that because the two sides seem to agree on their overall approaches, an agreed outcome is a sure thing. Let's look now at the two broad probable possible outcomes, the success or the failure of those Vienna talks. Diplomacy, like politics, is a question of making hard choices, none of them offering ideal outcomes, and all of them requiring compromise if they are to work. It is as well, from the outset, to have a hard-headed view of the likely consequences of either of those two outcomes, success or failure. First, let's look at failure. It has to be assumed, I believe, that Iran in those conditions would continue to creep closer to having weapons-grade nuclear material. Indeed, it is very possible that Iran would accelerate that progress and, as its Majlis has called for, would cut off the International Atomic Energy Agency's indispensable inspection processes. This would bring all those who have said that Iran must not under any circumstances be permitted to have a weapons capability, and that's pretty well the whole of the United Nations, including the 5 permanent members. It will bring them up against a quandary. Would their response extend then to military action? To assume it would not would, I think, be a foolhardy assumption, as would be any underestimation of the negative consequences of another war in a region already beset by too many of them, and that with the largest and most populous country in the region, Iran. Nor would the costs of failure stop there. The risks of other countries in the region reacting to Iran moving ahead or accelerating its program by seeking themselves nuclear weapons, either by purchase for example, by Saudi Arabia from Pakistan, or by development. I think the risks of that will be pretty high, potentially triggering off a nuclear arms race in a singularly volatile region. I think those risks would be high. And the risk too is that Iran, if it were to break out from the disciplines set down in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, would signal the effective demise of what has been described, that treaty has been described as, correctly in my view, as a cornerstone of international peace and security. That risk too would be real. Okay, well, let's look at the alternative, success in reviving the JCPOA. Well, that certainly wouldn't be a bed of roses. Iran's developing ballistic missile capability is a threat to its neighbors, and its involvement in a whole string of proxy wars in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Gaza is a major disruptive and destabilizing factor throughout the Middle East. But all those challenges would be considerably easier to address if a nuclear breakout by Iran had been rolled back to where it would have been if there had been full compliance by all the parties to the JCPOA as it was negotiated. It would be a shot in the arm for the UN's peacemaking efforts in Yemen. It could help to create the conditions for a reduction of tensions in and around Syria, and particularly if there is a changing of the guard in both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, it could lead to the resumption of efforts to bring about a two-state solution. And that, of course, is likely to be uppermost in the minds of everyone listening to this this week while we watch in some horror what is going on in Gaza and in Israel. Well, there are a lot of ifs there. That's what you will say to me. And indeed, you're right. But not one of those desirable developments would be made more difficult by reviving the JCPOA. And every one of them would be made more hard, and not any one of them would be made more hard to achieve, and every one of them would be made more hard to achieve, if not impossible, should reviving the JCPOA fail. In the medium to long term, the objective all countries, both those in the region and those outside it with interests there, should be encouraged to pursue, I would suggest, is to negotiate some multilateral structures committing all concerned to non-interference, peaceful coexistence, and economic cooperation. Such a framework is not compatible with an Iran possessing nuclear weapons or the capacity to deploy them at very short notice. So, in conclusion, a lot is riding on those talks going on in Vienna, and we should not, I would suggest, be distracted by too much speculation about the results of Iran's presidential election in June and the likelihood of a hardline candidate winning that contest, which must be considered quite high. The reality is that the final decision on the Iranian side will be taken by Ayatollah Khamenei, and that it will need the support of all parts of the complex political scene in that country. So that's what I have to say about this issue of reviving the JCPOA, and I will listen with interest to other contributions. Thank you.